Norris Pickens moved through the standing corn at a pace no man his age should have managed, boots cutting a line through green rows already flattened wide by rotor wash, one hand out ahead of him and the other pinned close to his ribs. The Black Hawk sat canted in the ruin of a quarter-acre he'd planted in April, its engine note dying into something ragged and wrong, a warning light strobing red through the windscreen glass in a rhythm nobody inside seemed able to kill. He did not run. He walked the way a man walks, toward something he has walked toward 1,000 times before, and a cigar tin rode in his tractor's toolbox, 200 yards behind him. A tin Norris Pickens had never once let another pair of hands open, and it would be the first thing he reached for once those rotors finally stopped turning. If you've ever watched someone dismiss a quiet man before finding out what he built with his own hands, you already know where this is going. The truck came fast down the access road, throwing gravel, and Dale Quillen was out of it before it had fully stopped rolling. A length of coated wire looped through his belt with a clipped stack of printed pages swinging off it. He was 34, sharp-jawed, dressed like a man who had never once had to kneel in mud to do his job, and he crossed the cut cornstalks already talking. "Sir, I need you off this property line right now." He didn't slow down to say it. "This is an active military aircraft with a fuel hazard and a rotor arc that will take your head off before you know it's happening. Go on back to your fence before you get yourself hurt." Norris kept walking, his eyes on the tail rotor, on the particular stutter in its turn that told him more than the strobing light did. "She's not going to hurt me," Norris said. "She's hurt already." Quillen didn't hear the difference. He heard an old man in a canvas coat standing too close to government property, and he lifted a hand flat toward Norris's chest without touching him, the universal gesture for a thing you expect to obey you. "That's not your call to make, sir. This is a certified incident site." He glanced down at his run sheet as if it might back him up. "I'll have someone escort you to the road." Behind him, young men in flight suits were already circling the airframe with laptops and cable harnesses, none of them looking at the 78-year-old farmer they'd just been told to walk off his own land, none of them knowing that the last man who'd rigged this aircraft's direct ancestor by hand, tolerance by tolerance, for 22 years, was standing 11 feet away from them with a bad shoulder and a very specific idea of what was wrong. 3 hours earlier, before any of that, Norris had been on his knees in the dust of his own machine shed with his good arm buried to the elbow in a tractor's steering linkage, working by feel the way he'd worked most mornings for longer than some of these soldiers had been alive. His left shoulder would not lift past the height of his own chest, hadn't since a rigging cable had taken it wrong decades back, and so he did not reach for things the way other men reached for things. He turned his whole body toward whatever needed turning toward, a slow, economical pivot that looked, from a distance, like patience. He wore the canvas barn coat he wore in every season that wasn't full summer, gone the color of dry cornstalks from years of weather, buttoned to the throat over a chambray shirt, even with sweat already collecting at his collar. He finished the linkage, wiped the grease from 2 fingers with a rag that had long since stopped being white, and reached into the tractor's toolbox for the cigar tin that lived there. He opened it. Inside, resting on a strip of felt he'd cut himself, was a length of shim steel no longer than a table knife, its edge filed down in a graduated taper, notches cut into it at intervals that matched no chart printed by any manufacturer living or dead. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has looked at 10,000 times and never tired of. Then he closed the tin, set it back in its corner of the toolbox, and said nothing about it to anyone, because there had never once been anyone to say it to. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, nearly 9 hours before that helicopter would ever clear his tree line, Norris started the tractor in the yard and let it idle, running rough for the first 30 seconds, and then settling into a low, steady thrum that carried across the yard and up through the kitchen window where Harriet Pickens stood drying a bowl she didn't need to dry anymore. She'd married him 53 years ago and had not missed many afternoons at that window since, and Norris had not missed many afternoons running that engine for her to hear, a standing arrangement between the two of them that had never once needed to be spoken aloud in all that time. He didn't wave, she didn't either. The engine ran 4 minutes, and he shut it off, and that was the whole of it. Now, In the flattened corn, none of that mattered to Dale Quillen, who had a run sheet in his hand and a battalion's reputation riding on the next 30 hours, and who saw only an old man too close to a wounded aircraft. Sir, per Army regulation, civilian personnel are required to maintain a minimum clearance of 500 feet from any aircraft under active fault investigation. Quillen read the number off his sheet like it was scripture, not looking up. I don't have time to argue jurisdiction with a farmer. Tobias, get him back to the fence. A young crew chief peeled off from the huddle around the airframe, dark-eyed, sunburned at the collar, moving toward Norris, with more apology in his shoulders than in his orders. This was Tobias Nolan, 24 years old, 3 years in and on his first posting worth remembering, and something in the older man's stillness made him slow his approach before he reached him. Sir, I need you to come with me, Tobias said, quieter than Quillen had said anything. Norris didn't argue. He turned his whole body toward the aircraft one more time, listening past the men and the alarms to the tail rotor's stutter, the specific hitch in it that repeated every third rotation, patient as a heartbeat that wasn't quite right. That's not the rotor, Norris said, mostly to himself, mostly to Tobias, mostly to no one. That's the swashplate talking. Something's rubbing that's not supposed to touch. Quillen looked up from his sheet at that, more startled than he wanted to show, then covered it with the flat authority of a man, restating a rule he'd already stated once. Sir, our diagnostics will identify the fault. We appreciate your concern for government property, but I need this area clear. He nodded at Tobias, and Tobias, uneasy but obedient, put a light hand near Norris's elbow and walked him back toward the fence line, past the flattened stalks, past the truck, back to where a corn farmer apparently belonged. Norris let himself be walked. He'd learned decades ago that a man who already knows the answer can afford to wait for the room to catch up. The fence line held him for 3 hours, and in all that time, nothing about the aircraft got quieter. Norris stood with his forearms crossed over the top rail, weight settled onto his right leg because his left hip had opinions about standing on uneven ground for that long, and watched 4 different technicians take turns feeding cable harnesses into the airframe's diagnostic port. Every readout came back clean. Every gauge, every sensor, every line of data scrolling across a laptop propped on the tailgate of Quillen's truck told the same story. No fault found. And every time the engine turned over on ground idle to confirm those readings, the whole aircraft shuddered in a way that made 2 of the younger men take an involuntary step back from the rotor arc, because a machine that clean on paper does not usually shake like something with a bone out of joint. Quillen stood over the laptop with his run sheet still clipped to his belt, reading the diagnostic summary aloud to nobody in particular, the way a man recites a verdict he's already decided is final. 0 faults registered across primary and secondary flight control systems. Vibration signature inconsistent with sensor data. He said it twice, as if repetition might resolve the contradiction, sitting 6 feet in front of him with a warning light still bleeding red through the windscreen. Tobias crouched near the tail boom with a flashlight, running his hand along a linkage housing he'd already inspected twice, and found himself glancing toward the fence more often than the job required. Norris hadn't moved, hadn't spoken since being walked off the field. Just stood there in his canvas coat with the sun working its way west, watching the aircraft the way a man watches weather coming, without hurry and without doubt. At the 2-hour mark, Tobias set the flashlight down, wiped his palms on his coveralls, and crossed the flattened corn without asking anyone's permission. Quillen was 30 yards off, on the phone with someone at the battalion, and didn't see him go. Sir, Tobias kept his voice low, glancing back once. You said swashplate. Our system's telling us the linkage geometry is within spec. Every measurement checks out. I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking for that a full diagnostic suite can't already see. Norris turned his whole body toward him, the slow, economical pivot of a man whose shoulder had made its terms known long ago, and considered the question the way he considered most things, without rushing to fill the silence. Your equipment can measure what's there, Norris said. It can't measure what's already worn away. A part can be within tolerance, and still be telling you it's tired. That's not failure. That's wear. talking before failure gets there. Tobias stood with that a moment, turning it over the way you'd turn over a coin looking for a mint mark. It didn't match anything in his training, and it matched everything he'd felt in his hands, running along that housing twice, without finding a thing wrong with it. "How do you know the difference," he asked, "between wear and failure?" "Same way you know a friend's cough from a stranger's," Norris said. "You have to have heard it before it got bad." He didn't say anything else, and Tobias didn't ask anything else, because something in the plainness of it closed the subject better than any answer twice as long would have. Tobias went back to the aircraft with the flashlight still off in his hand, and didn't tell Quillen where he'd been. Another hour passed with no better luck. The fourth technician came off the airframe shaking his head, and Quillen, off the phone now and out of patience, stood with his hands on his hips, staring at a machine that refused to be wrong on his terms. It was Colonel's authority that finally moved him, though the Colonel wasn't there yet. It was simpler than that. It was Tobias, standing at Quillen's elbow, saying the thing out loud that he'd been carrying since the fence line. "Sir, we've tried everything the manual gives us. That old man out there named the exact system in about 4 seconds, without a harness, without a laptop, just by listening. I think we let him look." Quillen turned to find Norris still at the fence, unmoved, unbothered, and something in the set of the old man's stillness needled at him worse than any argument could have. "Fine," Quillen said, mostly to be done arguing. "But he doesn't sign anything, and he doesn't touch anything I haven't cleared." "Bring him up." They brought him up. Norris walked back through his own flattened corn a second time, slower now with the day's standing catching up in his hip, and stopped at the base of the airframe to look up at it, the way another man might look up at a church steeple he'd once helped raise. He didn't ask for tools. He went to his own tractor, parked at the field's edge where he'd left it that morning, and took the cigar tin from the toolbox himself, cradling it against his ribs with his good arm, the way he'd carried it for longer than most of these soldiers had been breathing. He climbed the access panel with his shoulder dictating the whole sequence. Right hand first, body turned, weight shifted, the same order every time, because a man who cannot reach can still be exact about how he doesn't reach. He opened the panel. He opened the tin. He drew out the length of shim steel and set his 2 working fingers against the swashplate linkage, the way another man might set 2 fingers against a wrist, feeling for a pulse only he knew how to read. He worked in silence, and the crowd below him went silent with him, technicians and crew chiefs, and Quillen all watching a 78-year-old farmer thread a strip of hand-filed steel into a gap none of their gauges had flagged, turning it a fraction, checking it, turning it back, checking it again, in a sequence that had the unmistakable rhythm of something done 10,000 times before, on a different machine, in a different decade, for reasons none of them yet understood. The engine came up to idle on his signal. The shudder that had haunted every reading for 3 hours smoothed into a clean, steady turn. The warning light blinked once more, and went dark, and stayed dark. Norris climbed back down, closed the tin, and looked at Quillen with no triumph in his face at all, only the flat satisfaction of a job closed out correctly. "Sergeant First Class Norris Pickens," he said, "Rotary Wing Maintenance Chief, 22 years. I built the ancestor of the bird you're standing under before half these boys were born." Nobody laughed this time. Nobody said a word for the length of 3 full breaths, and the only sound in the flattened corn was the engine Norris had just quieted, running exactly the way it was supposed to. Quillen was the first to move, and what he did was reach for his run sheet like a man reaching for solid ground. He stopped, started again, quieter. "That's a hell of a repair. I'm not disputing what I just watched." He flipped a page, found the language he needed, and something in his voice hardened back into procedure even as his eyes hadn't fully caught up. "But I can't certify this aircraft as airworthy on the strength of it. You don't hold a current FAA airframe and power plant certificate. You don't hold a current military maintenance credential. Whatever you did up there, and I saw it, I can't log it. Without a licensed signature, this bird doesn't fly." Tobias's face fell in a way he didn't try to hide. "Sir, he just fixed what 4 of us and a full diagnostic suite couldn't find." I know what I saw, Quillen said, and for the first time since he'd stepped out of his truck, there was no citation in his voice, only a man, caught between what his eyes told him and what his sheet allowed him to write down. This aircraft is scheduled for a disaster relief airlift. Wheels up in 30 hours, or it misses the window and rotates to the next lift, 3 weeks out, past the days that matter most, on the ground where it's headed. I need this fixed by someone I can legally put a name to. There's a legacy provision, Norris said, plain as anything. For chiefs who trained before the current credentialing stood up, it doesn't need a current license, it needs a service record showing you held the qualification once and someone with authority to recognize it. Quillen was already shaking his head before Norris finished, not out of malice now, out of something closer to dread. I know that provision. I know it because 2 years ago my audit program flagged the entire legacy maintenance archive as a storage and liability cost and recommended it for purge. Handwritten logs, most of them decades old, unreadable to current systems. I didn't write that recommendation personally, but I built the program that carried it out. He looked at the run sheet in his hand, like it had turned to something heavier. If your record was in that archive, Mr. Pickens, it's gone. I helped make sure of it. The corn stood very still around them, and for a long moment nobody in that field had an answer for what came next. Colonel Simone Merivale arrived 40 minutes later in a staff vehicle that came up the access road at a speed that told everyone watching she'd already heard enough to be worried, and she was out of it before the driver had it fully in park, boots hitting gravel with the particular economy of someone who had walked onto 100 incident sites and expected the 101st to look like all the rest. It did not. She crossed the flattened corn expecting an equipment failure and a battalion's timeline in jeopardy, and she found instead an old man in a canvas coat standing at the base of the aircraft with a cigar tin under one arm, and something about the shape of him stopped her mid-stride. She was 52, silver threading through dark hair, cut short and practical, and she had the bearing of a woman who had spent 26 years since her lieutenant's bars, learning exactly how much of command was patience. She looked at Norris Pickens for 3 full seconds before she said anything, and when she spoke, it wasn't to Quillen. "Sergeant Pickens," she said, and it wasn't a question. Norris turned his whole body toward her voice. The same slow pivot he turned toward everything, and something in his face shifted the way a man's face shifts when a name from a long time ago walks back into the room wearing a different rank. "Lieutenant Merivale," he said, "you've done some growing since Fort Campbell." "Colonel now," she said, it almost apologetically, like the rank embarrassed her standing next to him. 26 years, Sergeant. I have flown a great many aircraft since the one you grounded on me at 0400, with your hand still greasy from checking it yourself." Quillen, standing off to the side with his run sheet forgotten at his hip, looked between them with the particular stillness of a man watching a conversation rewrite everything he thought he understood about the day. "You grounded her aircraft," Tobias said slowly, working it out loud, 26 years ago. "He caught a wear pattern in my tail rotor pitch links that every instrument on that flight line called within spec," Merivale said, not taking her eyes off Norris. "Said it was talking to him wrong. I argued with him. I was 26 years old and certain the numbers were the truth. He pulled me off that bird anyway, over my objection and over my commanding officer's objection, and had it stripped down by hand. Found the same fault he found here today. Except that one, if it had flown, would have failed somewhere over open water with 11 of us aboard." She let that sit a moment in the flattened corn. "I owe this man considerably more than a courtesy, Mr. Quillen, and I intend to pay some part of it back today, if the paperwork will let me." She turned to Quillen fully then, and her voice sharpened into the register of a woman used to being obeyed without repeating herself. "Tell me about this legacy provision I've been briefed on in the truck." Quillen swallowed once before he answered. "Ma'am, the provision exists. It would let you personally certify Sergeant Pickens's repair on the strength of his prior qualification, bypassing current credentialing requirements. But it requires the original service documentation, a logbook entry showing he held the rating, ideally from his own hand, from his own era." He hesitated, and the hesitation cost him something visible. That archive was purged 2 years ago. My program recommended it. I signed off on the disposal schedule myself, ma'am, not knowing what was in it or who it belonged to. Merivale's jaw set, just slightly, the only crack in a composure otherwise built for exactly this kind of news. Then we have 30 hours, an aircraft that runs because of a man's bare hands, and a legal mechanism to authorize him that depends on a record you already destroyed. Yes, ma'am, Quillen said, and for the first time all day, there was no citation in it, no run sheet to hide behind. Just a man standing in a cornfield realizing the gap he'd enforced all afternoon was one he himself had helped carve. The whole field seemed to hold its breath around that admission, waiting on an old farmer who hadn't said a word since the colonel arrived and who was already, quietly, reaching for the tin under his arm a second time. Norris didn't say anything for a moment. He simply turned, walked the 11 steps back to his own tractor at the field's edge, and set the cigar tin on the fender, the way he might set down something that had waited its whole life to be asked for. He opened it. The feeler stock lay where it always lay, on its cut felt, and beneath it, folded into quarters gone soft and pale at the creases, was a single sheet of paper he lifted out with 2 fingers and did not hurry to unfold. I kept my own copy, Norris said, to no one, and to all of them. Never saw the need to use it, didn't figure I'd outlive the need. He handed it to Colonel Merivale, and she took it the way you take something you're afraid might not survive the handling, and unfolded it there in the flattened corn with Quillen and Tobias and the whole crew watching. It was a service log page, carbon faded, dated in a hand that had grown surer with time. Merivale went quiet reading it, and then her breath caught, audibly, once, and she pressed the back of her free hand hard against her mouth for a moment before she trusted herself to speak. "That's my signature," she said, low. "Countersigned as the qualifying witness, Fort Campbell, 1998. I signed this the week after he pulled me off that aircraft. I was 26 years old, and I didn't understand yet what I was signing my name under." She looked up at Norris, and whatever was in her face then, she let stand there, unhidden, for everyone in that field to see. "You've had this the whole time. You could have used it any day these last 2 years, to force my program to answer for what it did to your record. You never did. Wasn't looking to be proved right," Norris said. "Was looking to keep the corn in the ground, and the tractor running." Quillen stepped forward then, and something in the way he crossed that last stretch of flattened stalks had none of the certainty he'd carried off his truck that morning. He held out a hand, and when Norris took it, Quillen didn't let go right away. "I owe you an apology I don't think fits in the time we've got," Quillen said. "I'll refile the provision myself, tonight, with this page attached, and I'll write the correction into the permanent record so it can't be purged again by someone who doesn't know what they're looking at. Whatever else you need from me, Sergeant Pickens, you tell me and it's done." Norris considered that, the way he considered most things, without hurry. "Don't put my name on it any bigger than it needs to be," he said. "Put down the ones who trained me. There were 4 of them, and not one's alive to ask for it himself. That's the debt worth settling." The Black Hawk lifted off the following morning, with 11 hours to spare against the deployment window, climbing out over Norris Pickens's flattened corn, in a clean, steady turn, with no warning light bleeding through the glass, and Norris watched it go from the fence line, with his forearms crossed over the top rail, the way he'd watched it arrive. Tobias lingered a moment before boarding, lifted a hand toward the fence, and Norris lifted his good arm back, no more and no less than that. Weeks later, the corn stood taller, and the flattened quarter-acre had begun to green back over, and at 4 o'clock on an ordinary afternoon, Norris started his tractor in the yard, the way he had every clear day for as long as either of them could count, the engine catching rough, and then settling into that same low, steady thrum. He didn't fix that tractor for himself. He fixed it because Harriet still liked to hear it running when she looked out the kitchen window at 4 o'clock, the way she'd looked out that window for 53 years running, and the feeler stock rode back in its cigar tin in the toolbox where it always rode. Tolerances known to exactly one living man and unmarked on any chart anywhere. Somewhere in your own family, A record like that one is probably still sitting folded in a tin, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Harriet raised one hand from the window as the sound reached her, the way she always did, and Norris, out in the yard with the engine running steady under his hand, didn't need to look up to know she was there.